Hello, and welcome to C21 B1 Plus Coursebook, Unit 3C. Today, we're looking at memory and learning. So, to begin, let's start about how we remember information. I'm going to have some of these questions from Edpuzzle appear on your screen. Please take a few minutes and answer them with your answers. Try to give as much information as possible. Now, let's look at our study skills on page 55. Memorization. A good memory can help us in all parts of our life. It's especially helpful as a student. There are some ways you can use to help you memorize information. When you read, highlight and underline information. This is very helpful, but it's really useful for visual learners. Use mnemonics like acronyms or sentences that remind you of information. For example, this is a mnemonic device, it's a fun word, to remember the names of the planets in English. My very educated mother just served us noodles, which stands for Mercury, Venus, Earth, where we live, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. This is an example of a mnemonic device. You can come up with your own to help you remember information. Next, you can link the information with people that you know. So, if you need to remember the first planet on the sun, you think of your small friend, Matt, who is very small. So, Matt is small and makes me think of Mercury, the smallest planet and the one closest to the sun. You can chunk long numbers into smaller parts with 2 or 3 digits each. This means to put numbers together. For example, my old phone number, 373-2601, I remember as a chunk of information. Try to create a mental image. The funnier, the better. For example, one of my favorite words that I wanted to learn in Arabic was modir. So, I came up with a funny mental image. I always think of this football manager as a Super Saiyan. I always think that he is not a moderate modir. It's a funny picture that helps me remember the word modir. Next, you could tell a story that contains the information in the order you need to remember it. This is another good way to memorize the information you're trying to learn. Let's come back to Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus, and Neptune. You can think of a story that starts with a little boy named Mercury, and who meets a new friend, and her name is Venus. And they want to travel to the planet Earth. When they get to Earth, they eat a Mars candy bar and drink a Jupiter-sized glass of Coca-Cola. Next, they look through a telescope to see Saturn. And when then they decide to get in a spaceship and fly there, but they miss and end up at Uranus, where they then make a phone call to their friend on Neptune. Whatever you want, come up with your own silly story. Or, if you want, invent a song, or change the lyrics of a song you know to help you remember what you need to remember. And if you're trying to remember bigger pieces of text, Read the text once silently and once out loud. Copy it out by hand. Ask someone to read it to you, or record yourself reading it and listening to the recording of it. Listen to the text while reading it. Repeat these steps, A through D, as often as possible, and test yourself by reciting the text to someone else. Now, let's get back to our unit. We're going to listen to a talk on memory. Listen to the recording, and at the end of the recording, you'll have a chance to answer the questions on page 48. Answer the questions in your textbook, and then choose the correct answers in the multiple choice questions in the Edpuzzle. If you need to listen again, don't forget you can click Rewatch.
When we talk about memory, we should remember that there are actually 3 types of memory, and they are all used in the process of remembering something for a period of time. There is sensory memory. Then there is working memory. Finally, there is long-term memory. These act as a kind of filter because we receive massive amounts of information and, of course, we don't want to store it all. The process begins when we receive information or stimuli. These stimuli could be through something we see, hear, touch, smell, and so on. And they are received by our sensory memory. The sensory memory is capable of receiving huge amounts of information, but it can't retain much, nor can it hold the information for a long time. It can hold 3 to 7 units of information and only for less than a second. Most of the information received will then be forgotten. However, the working memory will pay attention to any information that seems important, while ignoring any information that doesn't. In the working memory, about 7 units can be stored for a maximum of 30 seconds. This is if the information is not repeated. However, the more often information is repeated or used, the higher the chance that it will move through to the long-term memory. As this process occurs, it is put into a kind of code so that it can be stored. As the name suggests, the long-term memory can potentially remember information forever, for a lifetime. Again, this is achieved through repetition, and there are no limits to how much information could be stored in the long-term memory. In other words, the capacity is infinite. When a memory is needed at a later time, it can then be retrieved from the long-term memory and into the working memory.
Now, make sure you answer the questions in your textbook on page 48 under 3.3 and use those to answer the questions on Edpuzzle. Now we're going to move to section 3, looking at the adverts of 2 different, very different language schools. Look at the adverts for these 2 very different language schools in your textbook on page 49. How are the schools different? Answer the question on Edpuzzle. Which school do you prefer? Give at least one sentence to explain your answer. Now, we're going to listen to 2 friends discussing one of the schools. Which school are they talking about? And do they agree with each other? What reasons do they give for their opinions? Let's listen.
A. This method seems good to me because I think teachers should always correct mistakes. In my experience, it's the only way people improve.
Next one.
B.
I'm not so sure about that. I agree with Professor Hawthorne when he says that you need a balance between accuracy and fluency.
Make sure you've answered the question here in Edpuzzle. Now, read the texts again and answer the questions in your book on page 49 and use those answers to answer the questions on Edpuzzle. Now, let's look at page 54 in your textbook. when it comes to the study skills, answering questions about photos. Here on page 54, we've got this section, answering questions about photos. In your exams, especially the speaking exams, it is very common to have to talk about, describe, compare, and contrast pictures. Then after that, you generally have to answer a question about those pictures. It's usually a question about your opinion. Make sure you give some time at the end of your response to answer the question. Make sure you give your opinion and explain why you think this is the answer for you. And if it's suitable, if it's a good thing to do for that question, give some example or some evidence to support your opinion. When it comes to your speaking tests in this class, you may have to do something very similar, such as this, looking at the two pictures. They show people learning at university level. Describe and compare the two pictures. Then answer a following question. Which method do you think is more effective? The second student will have to answer a different question. How do you prefer to learn? So, what you can take away from this is that in your speaking quizzes, it will probably be you and a friend. You may be looking at two pictures. You will probably need to describe each picture. Then, compare and contrast the pictures. How are they similar? How are they different? And then answer a question about your opinion about some topic from the pictures. Today, you should find a friend in class and call them on WhatsApp, on Teams, on Snapchat. I don't care how you call your friend. But look at this page together, page 54, and look at the two pictures. Take turns working together, describing and comparing the pictures. How are they similar? How are they different? And take a minute to answer these opinion questions together. That is the end of Unit 3C.